I stood in the foyer, the scent of fresh beeswax and old mahogany filling my lungs. The sunlight caught the dust motes dancing above the refinished hardwood, a golden haze that felt like a hard-won victory. It was peaceful now, but peace is expensive. If I had to summarize the last 36 months of my life to a stranger, I would say this. I spent 3 years renovating the ruined house I inherited. Then my parents tried to sue me, claiming my sister deserved half of it. So I set a legal trap and buried their case. It started in a beige conference room that smelled of stale coffee and desperation. My grandfather had been dead 3 weeks, and my sister, Katrina, was already mentally spending her share. When the lawyer read the distribution, her eyes lit up like a slot machine hitting the jackpot. She received $95,000 in liquid cash from the insurance policy. I got the deed to the Victorian on Elm Street. In her eyes, I had drawn the short straw. She actually laughed, a sharp, brittle sound, and told me to have fun with the ghosts. She wasn't wrong to laugh, at least not then. The house was effectively a rotting carcass. The foundation had a crack you could slide a fist into, and the roof leaked in 14 different places, creating black mold tapestries on the plaster. The city had already sent condemnation notices threatening demolition. My father, Victor, shook his head at me outside the lawyer's office. He told me I was a sentimental idiot for not fighting for the cash. He said the property was a liability, a money pit that would bury me alive. I didn't listen. Instead, I quit my apartment lease in Atlanta and moved into a cramping nylon tent in the backyard because the floors inside weren't safe to walk on. For 3 years, I existed on ramen noodles, peanut butter, and sheer stubbornness. I learned plumbing from YouTube videos at the public library and taught myself electrical work by flickering candlelight. I spent my nights scraping layers of lead paint off the hand-carved railings my grandfather had made himself. I bled into this house, sometimes literally, determined to save the only thing he left behind. Slowly, the ruin became a home again. I restored the wraparound porch to its original glory and replanted my grandmother's vegetable garden. The smell of mold was replaced by cedar and varnish. Then, yesterday, came the email that changed everything. I opened the notification from the county tax assessor on my phone, my hands shaking just a little. I expected a modest increase, maybe enough to cover the materials. I was wrong. The new appraisal value sat on the screen in stark, bold black font, $485,000. I stared at the number until the sharp pixels blurred. The sweat equity had paid off beyond my wildest calculations. I was almost half a millionaire on paper, standing in a house I had rebuilt with my own 2 hands. A grin started to spread across my face, but it froze instantly. Tax assessments are public record. Updates get mailed out to previous executors. My father, the insurance agent who watched every penny, would see this. The phone in my pocket buzzed, displaying a name I hadn't seen in 2 years, Dad. I pulled into my driveway an hour later, the gravel crunching under my tires like grinding teeth. I expected an empty house, a quiet evening to process my new reality. Instead, I found a luxury car dealership parked on my lawn. My father's black Cadillac blocked the garage, and Katrina's white Mercedes sat squarely on the new sod I'd laid last month. My stomach dropped. I hadn't given them a key, but I remembered giving my mother the door code when I broke my arm last winter. She had never deleted it. I walked through the front door, the digital lock chirping a mockingly cheerful welcome. The air inside felt heavy, displaced by expensive perfume and thick tension. My father sat at the head of my dining table, his hands folded over a leather folio as if he were chairing a board meeting. My mother perched nervously to his right, while Katrina sprawled on my velvet sofa, scrolling through her phone. She didn't look up, but her Gucci sneakers were resting directly on the vintage fabric. They had staged an intervention, but I wasn't the addict. Victor didn't waste time with pleasantries or greetings. He gestured to the empty chair opposite him, commanding rather than asking. He started talking about family equity and the unintended consequences of the probate valuation. He spoke smoothly, using words like rebalancing and fair market adjustment. He had done the math. The house could support a $200,000 withdrawal. I should take out the loan, give half to Katrina to correct the disparity, and keep the rest as compensation for my labor. He made robbery sound like sensible accounting. I didn't sit down. I stood in the archway, feeling the vibration of the floorboards I had nailed down myself. I looked at Katrina, who was finally watching me with a bored expression. I reminded them of the day they laughed at me. I quoted my father calling this place a money pit and a liability. I told them this wasn't a negotiation because I didn't remember seeing any of them holding a sander or a paintbrush. The silence that followed was absolute. My mother looked down at her hands. Victor's face darkened, the polished salesman veneer cracking to reveal the bully underneath. He stood up, towering over the table, his knuckles white against the mahogany surface. He told me I was being selfish and forgetting who raised me. He said the house was family property, regardless of whose name was currently on a piece of paper. He claimed he was trying to be generous, but I was forcing his hand. He wasn't asking anymore. He was telling me what was going to happen in my own house. Then came the detail that turned my blood to ice. He opened the leather folio and slid a document across the table. It wasn't a proposal, it was a pre-filled loan application with a yellow sticky note attached. He told me he had already spoken to a loan officer at his bank who was expecting my signature Monday morning. If I didn't sign, he hinted at legal complications that would freeze the title indefinitely. My father's jaw tightened, and I realized he hadn't come to negotiate. He had come to raid me. 4 days after the ambush, the threat materialized in my mailbox. It wasn't a text or a phone call this time, it was a thick, cream-colored envelope sent via certified mail. I signed for the packet with a heavy hand, the postman looking at me with mild curiosity as I took the pen. Inside was a formal demand for a constructive trust. The letter claimed an implied verbal agreement existed between my grandfather and me to share the equity. It was a lie, but it was a lie printed on expensive stationery. I drove straight to a sticky, floored wing joint in Decatur to meet Damien. He had been my best friend since sophomore year at Tech and was now a contracts attorney with tired eyes. The neon sign buzzed overhead as he read the document, wiping buffalo sauce from his fingers before touching the paper. He read it twice, his expression shifting from amusement to annoyance. He tossed it onto the table between our baskets of fries. He didn't look happy, and Damien was usually the most optimistic person I knew. Damien told me the legal argument was absolute garbage. Constructive trusts require evidence of an agreement, and the will was ironclad. On paper, I should win easily. But then he leaned in, lowering his voice over the noise of the crowded restaurant. He explained that family lawsuits are messy and emotional. Judges hate them. Sometimes, to make the screaming stop, a judge will try to split the baby just to clear the docket. Being right might not be enough to save my home. That was the part that made my stomach turn. If my father was willing to spend real money on billable hours, he could tie the title up for years. I couldn't sell, I couldn't refinance, and I would bleed cash fighting endless motions. Damien did the mental math out loud, estimating 50 grand in legal fees just to prove I owned my own house. My father knew this. He wasn't trying to win a trial, he was trying to bleed me dry until I surrendered. I asked Damien if he could represent me, but he shook his head immediately. He told me he was too nice and too close to the situation. He said, I didn't need a mediator or a contract lawyer. I needed someone who enjoyed the smell of blood. He wrote a name on a napkin and slid it across the table. Samantha. He described her as a real estate litigator who didn't take cases she couldn't win. She was expensive, but she was ruthless. I looked at the name scrawled in blue ink. This was the point of no return. Hiring Samantha meant declaring total war on my own flesh and blood. I thought about Katrina's smirk on my sofa and my father's arrogant demand for my signature. They expected me to fold like I always did, to be the quiet, obedient son who stepped aside. They were banking on my passivity. That realization hardened something inside my chest that had been soft for too long. I picked up my phone and dialed the number on the napkin right there in the restaurant. The receptionist answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional. I told her I had a property dispute involving a fraudulent constructive trust claim and fiduciary misconduct. Damien smiled grimly as I spoke. I didn't need a family counselor to fix this bridge. I needed a weapon to burn it down. I made the appointment for the next morning, ready to become the villain. Samantha's office was a converted Victorian in downtown Decatur, not unlike the one I had just spent 3 years bleeding over. The difference was the smell. Hers smelled of expensive leather and fear, not sawdust. I dumped 3 heavy binders onto her mahogany desk. They contained every receipt, every permit, and every time-stamped photo from the renovation. I had organized them chronologically, a habit from my engineering days. Samantha didn't offer me coffee or small talk. She simply opened the first binder and began to read, her eyes sharp and predatory. The silence in the room stretched for nearly 90 minutes, broken only by the scratching of her fountain pen on a yellow legal pad. I watched the dust motes dance in the window light, feeling my heart hammer against my ribs. She scrutinized the structural engineer reports and the foundation repair invoices. She flipped through the photos of the black mold and the collapsed porch. She was building a timeline of the house's resurrection. Finally, she closed the last binder and picked up the probate records I had brought. She stopped on the final page of the probate filing, her finger tracing a specific signature at the bottom. The room felt suddenly colder. She looked up at me over her reading glasses, her expression unreadable. She asked me who the executor of my grandparents' estate was. I told her it was my father, Victor. She asked if he had personally signed off on the original appraisal. I nodded. She leaned back in her high, back leather chair, and for the first time, a terrifyingly cold smile touched her lips. Samantha explained the trap my father had just walked into with the precision of a surgeon. She told me that, by signing the probate documents 3 years ago, Victor had legally certified the $68,000 valuation was accurate. If he was now claiming that figure was fraudulent to support a constructive trust, he was admitting to fiduciary fraud. He had either lied to the court then, or he was lying to the court now. There was no third option. He had handed us the shovel to dig his grave. The leverage shifted in the room so fast, It made my ears pop. Samantha tapped her pen against the desk, the rhythmic sound like a ticking clock. She told me that pursuing this strategy wouldn't just win the case, it could potentially expose him to criminal charges. She looked me dead in the eye and asked the question that would define the rest of my life. Did I want to let him crawl out of this with his dignity, or did I want to bury him deep? I thought about the way he had looked at me in my dining room, entitled and dismissive. I thought about Katrina's laughter when she took the cash and left me with the ruin. They hadn't shown me mercy when I was eating ramen in a tent. They hadn't hesitated to threaten my financial future for a quick payday. The hesitation I expected to feel wasn't there. I looked at Samantha and gave her the only answer that made sense. I told her to bury him. We spent the next hour drafting a response that was less a legal motion and more a declaration of war. Samantha dictated a letter to their attorney that outlined exactly how Victor had incriminated himself. We filed a motion for declaratory judgment, affirming my sole ownership based on his own sworn statements. We sent the letter via courier that afternoon, a tactical nuke wrapped in professional stationery. I walked out of her office into the bright afternoon sun, knowing I had just lit the fuse on my family. The silence of my Wednesday afternoon shattered when my phone buzzed against the blueprints. It was Wade, my neighbor and a retired Marine who spent his days restoring vintage Mustangs. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He asked if I was moving out. When I said no, he told me to get home immediately. There was a rental truck backed up to my porch, and a man in a suit was directing crewmen to load my furniture. My father was looting my house in broad daylight. I broke 3 traffic laws getting back to Covington. When I drifted sideways into my driveway, the scene was exactly as Wade had described. A 20-foot truck idled near the steps, its ramp deployed like a tongue. 2 men in gray jumpsuits were wrestling my leather armchair through the front door. My father stood at the bottom of the stairs, holding a clipboard and checking off items like he was managing inventory. He didn't even look up when my tires tore up the gravel. I slammed my car door and marched up the lawn, but Wade was already there. He had positioned his massive frame between the movers and the truck, arms crossed. The movers looked nervous, pausing with the chair hovering between them. I shouted at my father, demanding to know what he was doing. He finally looked at me, his expression calm and infuriating. He said he was securing family assets to prevent me from selling them before the court date. He spoke like he was doing me a favor. I turned my attention to the men holding my chair. I told them that I was the sole owner of the property, and they were currently accessories to a felony burglary. I warned them that if they didn't drop the furniture and leave, I would have their commercial license revoked by sunset. They didn't hesitate. They set the chair down on the grass, ignored my father's screaming orders, and scrambled into the cab. As they reversed down the driveway, my father threw his clipboard onto the lawn. Victor marched toward me, his face a dangerous shade of purple. He demanded to know why I was making this difficult, claiming executor authority. I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen. I showed him the live feed from the 4 high-definition security cameras I had installed the day after seeing Samantha. I had him on video entering without permission and removing property without a court order. I asked him if he wanted to wait for the sheriff or get off my land. He stared at the phone screen, realizing the trap had snapped shut. Without a word, he turned and stormed toward his Cadillac. As he pulled away, Another car screeched to a halt. Katrina jumped out of her white Mercedes, having apparently been watching from down the street. She didn't look like the confident Harris from the intervention. She looked frantic. She ran across the grass in her heels, screaming that I was a thief who had manipulated our grandfather into stealing her future. I stood my ground on the porch steps and told her to leave before I pressed charges for trespassing. She stopped a few feet away, her chest heaving. For a second, the anger dropped, and I saw something else entirely. Her hands were shaking violently, and her eyes were wide with genuine terror. She wasn't just mad about the money, she was scared to death of losing it. She whispered that I had no idea what I had done, then turned and fled. 2 weeks passed in a silence that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. I spent my evenings sanding the deep scratches the movers had left on the foyer floor, the repetitive motion grounding me, while I waited for the next shoe to drop. The security cameras watched the empty driveway with unblinking red eyes, recording nothing but falling leaves. Then Damien called me on a Tuesday night, his voice buzzing with the specific, electric energy of a man who had just solved a complicated riddle. He told me to sit down immediately. Damien had started pulling threads on Katrina's financial claims, and the sweater was unraveling fast. He pointed out the obvious contradictions I had been too angry to see clearly. She claimed in her affidavit that she was drowning in debt and couldn't make rent, yet she was driving a brand new Mercedes SUV with paper tags. She was posting photos from a boutique resort in Cabo while simultaneously pleading poverty to the court. The math simply didn't add up. Someone who is truly destitute doesn't buy designer luggage, they sell it. Damien had dug deeper. The bomb dropped when Damien sent a PDF to my inbox while we stayed on the line. It was a marriage certificate from Fulton County, dated 14 months ago. Katrina wasn't single, and she certainly wasn't struggling alone. She was legally married to Preston Whitmore IV. I recognized the name immediately. The Whitmore family owned half the strip malls in North Georgia. It was old money, sticky and deep. But the kicker wasn't the marriage itself. It was the witnesses listed on the document. Victor and my mother had signed the license. I stared at my parents' signatures, feeling a fresh wave of nausea hit my stomach. They had known for over a year. They had sat at my dining table, listened to Katrina cry about being destitute, and nodded along while knowing she was married into one of the wealthiest families in the state. The betrayal was absolute. They weren't just enabling her greed, they were active participants in a cover-up. I asked Damien why they would hide a marriage that should have been a trophy for a social climber like my father. Damien had a contact at a family law firm who owed him a favor, and the answer was buried in the Whitmore family trust. The trust had a specific, draconian stipulation regarding spousal support and asset commingling. If Preston married without family approval, his allowance was halved. But more importantly, if his spouse had significant assets or came from money, the allowance could be eliminated entirely to prevent fortune hunting. To keep the cash flowing, Katrina had to be poor. She had to be a charity case to survive the audit. It was a performance art piece designed for her in-laws. Katrina had painted herself as a scrappy, self-made woman from a struggling working class background. She lied about our parents' financial status, painting Victor's successful agency as a failing business. She claimed she had zero inheritance and no safety net. That was why she needed the cash from my house under the table. She couldn't deposit a check from her wealthy, husband to pay her debts without alerting the trust lawyers. She needed untraceable money, and she needed it fast. This explained the terror I had seen in her eyes when she stood on my lawn. She wasn't just broke, she was living on a precipice. If the Whitmore family lawyers found out she had inherited $95,000 and blown it in a year, or if they found out she was suing for equity in a $500,000 home, her cover story would disintegrate. She would be exposed as a fraud. Preston would lose his allowance, and her marriage would likely implode. She was trapped in a prison of her own design. I asked Damien what this meant for the lawsuit. He laughed, a dark, satisfied sound. He said it changed everything. We didn't just have a defense anymore, we had a nuclear option. If we revealed her marriage and true financial status in open court, she wouldn't just lose the case, she would lose her lifestyle. We had the leverage to make them regret every single threat they had made. I told him to call Samantha immediately. We needed to set up a deposition before they realized we knew the truth. I hung up the phone and walked out to the porch, looking at the spot where Katrina had screamed at me. I finally understood the game. They weren't suing me for justice. They were trying to launder money through my property to service a lie. They thought I was the weak link, the quiet engineer who would fold under pressure. They were wrong. I wasn't going to be their bank, and I certainly wasn't going to be their victim. I was going to be the reason their house of cards finally collapsed. The deposition took place on a gray Thursday morning in Samantha's conference room, a space designed to intimidate with heavy oak furniture. I sat in the corner, a silent observer to the demolition. Victor arrived first, wearing a suit that fit poorly, as if he had lost weight from stress. Katrina followed, dressed in muted tones that whispered humility, a stark contrast to the designer labels I knew she preferred. My mother was notably absent. They took their seats, avoiding my gaze. The air was thick with unvoiced hostility. Samantha began with the deceptive gentleness of a spider spinning silk. She asked Katrina about her current living situation and monthly expenses. Katrina fell into the role she had rehearsed, her voice trembling at the perfect frequency. She described the crushing weight of rent in Atlanta and the shame of being the only sibling struggling while I sat on a fortune. She cried on cue, wiping a single tear from her cheek. Victor nodded along, looking solemn. They had absolutely no idea the silk was actually a noose. The atmosphere shifted instantly when Samantha adjusted her glasses and looked up. She asked, "Mens ferente, are you currently married?" The room went dead silent. Katrina's weeping stopped abruptly, replaced by a flicker of genuine panic. She glanced at her lawyer, then at Victor, her eyes darting like a trapped animal. "I don't see how that is relevant," she stammered. Samantha didn't blink. She slid a certified copy of the marriage license across the polished table. "You are married to Preston Whitmore." "Correct." The paper hissed against the wood. Katrina's lawyer, who looked increasingly out of his depth, immediately objected. He claimed her marital status was a private matter unrelated to the property dispute. Samantha countered with ice in her voice. She argued that since the plaintiff was claiming extreme financial hardship as the basis for the constructive trust, her household income and spousal support were directly relevant. The objection was overruled before the lawyer could finish his sentence. Katrina had to answer. She whispered a reluctant, "Yes," looking at the table as if it might swallow her whole. Samantha pressed the advantage, drilling down into the finances. She asked about Preston's income, the family trust, and the monthly distributions. Katrina tried to be vague, using phrases like, I am not sure, and, hey handles the money. Samantha didn't let up. She asked specifically about the $8,000 monthly allowance. Katrina flinched. She admitted that her husband received support but claimed she didn't have access to it. She insisted she was still personally liable for her old debts. Samantha reached for the second folder in her stack and produced the financial disclosure forms Katrina had submitted with her lawsuit. In them, Katrina had sworn under penalty of perjury that she carried $67,000 in credit card debt. Samantha asked if those figures were accurate as of today. Katrina looked at her lawyer, who gave a slight nod, unaware of the landmine. Yes, she said, her voice stronger now. Those are accurate. She had just lied on the official record. Samantha smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes, which remained cold and calculating. Samantha opened the second folder and spread bank records across the table like a royal flush. We had subpoenaed records from 3 institutions. The statements clearly showed that Preston had paid off $45,000 of Katrina's. 3 days after their secret wedding, her current remaining balance was under $12,000. Katrina stared at the documents, her face draining of all color. Her lawyer picked up a sheet, read it, and actually closed his eyes. The drowning in debt narrative had evaporated, replaced by cold, hard evidence of perjury. Samantha wasn't finished. She pointed to a series of regular deposits into Katrina's personal checking account. $2,000 every month, transferred from a joint account she shared with Preston. Her debt was gone, and she was receiving a secret income she had failed to disclose. It was undeniable proof that she was hiding assets to maintain her poor status for the in-laws while trying to extort me. Victor looked at the ceiling, refusing to look at the daughter he had helped protect. The game was totally over. Katrina's lawyer called for an immediate recess. They huddled in the hallway for 40 minutes. When they returned, the lawyer looked exhausted. He announced they were withdrawing the lawsuit with prejudice, meaning it could never be refiled. Samantha held up a hand. She demanded a signed admission of false claims and a formal apology, or she would file motions for perjury and fraud by close of business. Your daughter lied under oath, Samantha told Victor. Sign the paper, or I destroy her marriage and your freedom. Victor snatched the pen and signed the apology with aggressive, jagged strokes. He didn't look at me. He just wanted to escape before the handcuffs came out. He stormed out. Katrina lingered for a moment, her face twisted into something ugly. This isn't over, she hissed. I will never forgive you for this. I looked her in the eye, feeling absolutely nothing. I don't need your forgiveness. Katrina, I said calmly. I just need you gone. She slammed the door, leaving me alone in the quiet. The restraining order was granted the following week. A sterile piece of paper that acted like a steel shield. In a town the size of Covington, secrets don't stay buried, and neither do court records. Word spread fast that Victor Ferrante needed a judge to order him to stay away from his own son. His insurance agency lost 3 major commercial clients within the quarter as the gossip mill churned. He shrank, both socially and professionally, retreating into a sullen silence I hadn't heard from him in decades. The bully had finally lost his pulpit. Katrina fared significantly worse. The apology she signed didn't stay confidential long enough to save her. One of the Whitmore family trust attorneys found the filing during a routine audit of her husband's finances. The prenup had a fraud clause, and they used it like a guillotine. Preston filed for divorce immediately to protect his allowance. She left the marriage with her clothes and her leased car, but no settlement. Last I heard, she was living in a rental in Marietta, working property management. She wanted a mansion, she got a one-bedroom apartment. The silence in the house felt different now. It wasn't lonely, it was clean, stripped of the anxiety that had lived in the walls. I went to the animal shelter 2 months after the dust settled. I found Rosie, an Australian Shepherd mix with one blue eye and a jag notch in her left ear. She had been passed over for weeks because she wasn't a perfect puppy. She looked at me with tired hope, and I knew she belonged here. We were both a little damaged, but we were still standing. My definition of family shifted that spring. It wasn't about blood anymore. It was about who showed up when the moving truck was in the driveway. Wade finished his Mustang restoration in April, a cherry, red beast that roared like a lion. He lets me drive it on weekends when I help him tune the carburetor. Ellen brings over banana bread every Tuesday. Not because she wants a loan, but just because she baked. They don't ask for anything. They just ask how my day was. That is what home actually feels like. I spent the quiet evenings restoring the vegetable garden in the backyard. I found my grandmother's original planting layout in a water-damaged album and followed it exactly. Now, the tomato plants are staked high, smelling of green vines and rich earth. Sometimes, when the wind blows through the cedar leaves, I can almost picture my grandfather standing by the railing. He didn't leave me a ruin to punish me. He left me a project to save me. He knew I was the only one who would strip the rot away to find the gold. I sat on the porch, swing as the sun began to dip below the tree line. The golden light hit the refinished floors through the open door, making them glow warm and inviting. Rosie was asleep at my feet, chasing rabbits in her dreams. I used to think I needed my father's respect to be a man. I used to think I needed to prove my worth to people who couldn't count. The sun set over Covington, casting long shadows on the lawn, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the darkness to fall.